Awesome. Now, beginning on page 492, we come to this super cool section about the Whorfian hypothesis. They don't introduce the word this early, but really this is what they're talking about. They're wanting to know, does the language that we use influence how we perceive the world or how we think our thoughts? A couple of, the author illustrates a couple of instances when somebody suggests that they believe that that if a language doesn't have a certain word in it, that concept must be more difficult for people in another language using another language to understand. The example here on page 492 and 493 is the lack of the word accountability in many other languages. In the example they use here is Italian, and they suggest that this person writing the blog post suggests that if the language doesn't include the word accountability in it, that if the closest thing is like responsibility, then it's difficult to enact governmental reforms that require accountability. But this kind of assumption, or this kind of comment, makes two underlying assumptions. And those are outlined there in the middle of the page. You see bullet point 1 and 2. And those assumptions are that if a language doesn't have a word that conveys a specific concept, then it's because the speakers don't care about that concept enough to make a word. Or, well, in addition to that, it also makes a second assumption, and the second assumption is that if a language doesn't have a specific word, then it's because speakers, that if a language doesn't have a specific word, that will mean that the people who speak that language will have a difficult time understanding that concept. But then the researcher takes several more pages to delineate for us the truth that these assumptions are erroneous. There's no way that that we can make these assumptions, and therefore we can't assume that just because a language doesn't have a word to convey something, that doesn't mean that the individuals who speak that language will struggle with a certain concept. It is true, though, as the author begins in the next section to describe, that if a word is important enough, that there will be that if a concept is important enough, that there will be words that reflect that. In the middle of page 494, she gives several different examples of how things could be cooked or heated. In some languages, you might find that if the people who frequently cook don't differentiate between these things because they have only one method of heating something up, then it wouldn't be important to have all these words. But in our culture, we have many different ways of cooking food, and we have many different words to reflect that. Another example that we find commonly in this literature about the Whorfian hypothesis is the aspect of color. All different cultures, all different people of all different cultures across the world can see different colors. They can see all of the spectrum of colors that exist. But some languages only have as little as 2 words for colors, or 3, or some have more, up to, in English, we have 11 words for colors. But the fact that we have more words for colors doesn't mean that we have the ability to perceive them better or differently necessarily than people who have fewer words for colors. For instance, people can tell if they only have 2 words for colors, one that's for light and one that's for dark. They can still see the difference between green and blue, for instance. They're not colorblind, but by only having one word to sort of encompass the concepts of blue and green together, we do find that there are certain effects. We'll talk about those actually in a little bit more detail in a bit, but for now we'll just know that it doesn't change how they perceive the colors, but it does change how they are able to respond to certain kinds of questions. Now on page 496 we come to another section, word to culture mismatches. In this section, we see that sometimes in a culture, there are words that communicate a concept, well, I sort of already said that. There's words that communicate some concepts in some languages, but not in others. And the example that's given here in this section at the beginning is that, for instance, in Farsi, there's only one word to communicate both men and women pronouns. But in some other languages, there are two. English, there are three generally used pronouns: he, she, or it. But in Chinese, there is only one, ta, which means he, she, or it, any of those. So instead of knowing different pronouns, you would just use one pronoun, and it wouldn't specify gender embedded in that pronoun. But does that necessarily mean that Chinese people or that people in Iran care less about gender? No. I shouldn't say no right off the bat. Perhaps it does, and perhaps it does. But the rest of the literature throughout this chapter suggests probably not. By way of analogy, the author of our text points out that languages can be a lot like houses. As you live in a house for several decades, you begin to accumulate a bunch of crap that you had picked up over the years. You had purchased at one point, or you'd been given by friends as gifts, and you've just kept it and held on to it because you anticipate that maybe you'll use it again someday, even if sometimes you haven't used it in years. It reflects our taste and our interest and our needs and our uses over a period of time, not just our current needs. So an example of this is in my house, I have some pictures of my son when he was much younger than he is now. I don't really pay attention to these pictures. They're they're not placed for guests. They're in a place that guests would not normally go, in the hallway upstairs. And these pictures are below my conscious perception. I never pay attention to them. I put them up because when they were recent, when they were new, I enjoyed looking at them, and it was reflective of my son at that time. But eventually I stopped paying attention to these pictures, and I pay attention to the more recent pictures that are put in more prominent places, right? That suggests that there are certain things, like that's just one example, but there are things in our house that we don't currently use that we did once use. Likewise, there are things in our language that we don't really need right now, but that we still sometimes use. Oftentimes, we get rid of these aspects of language, right? We can, if they're inflectional markers, we can get rid of them by not using them over a long period of time if something else has taken the place of them, like word order. However, there are sometimes vocabulary words that are more difficult to get rid of because we use them often. Sometimes vocabulary words will shift in their meaning. I've noticed in my lifetime that the word organic has shifted in meaning. That we use it sometimes to describe like fresh and innovative, but it didn't used to mean that. So sometimes vocabulary words will shift. We'll use the same word, but it'll have a different meaning. Sometimes words will fall out of vogue and they'll become archaic, and you can still use them, but most people don't know what they mean. But the vocabulary of a language generally reflects, much like a house does, the needs of previous generations, and also some of your own, but a lot of baggage comes from those previous generations. There is a tendency in some languages to invent new words much more readily than in other languages. For instance, the text on page 498 describes the fact that in German, people stick together lots of letter sequences readily without giving it a thought, and create new words all the time. English does this from time to time. We have a tendency to hyphenate words for a short period of time, for a period of a couple of years until it becomes mainstream, and then we sort of remove the hyphen and combine it into one word. I'm sure that you've noticed that throughout your life, that, for instance, full-time work has a hyphen right now, but probably will become a word of its own right in just a couple of years. Another word that used to be hyphenated that isn't anymore is pastime. Like if you want to do something that's your favorite pastime, then it's just one word now, but we used to hyphenate it. So this is so English has a slower process than German does, and some languages like French don't have a process for doing that at all. They just adopt a longer phrase composed of several words that mean the same thing. The example in the text here is like the word housecoat, which we've adopted, would be translated in French as robe de chambre. I can't say it with a French accent or pronounce it even correctly because I don't know French, but you'll forgive me for that, and you'll realize that this means dress for a bedroom, right? They use several words to convey this concept, even though the concept isn't more difficult for a French person to understand, right? Just because they don't have one word that means that. It's just that some languages are more prone to inventing new words than other languages. So we can't say that just because a language doesn't have one word to correspond with one concept, that the concept is more difficult, or that the culture doesn't care about that concept. Those are erroneous assumptions that we're making when we say the kinds of arguments that were presented in that blog post back on page 493.